being a Sonic fan feels weird sometimes. Sure, the series is a household name with over 30 years of games under its belt, with plenty of old-time classics. But at the same time, man, the SEGA never do him any favors. Whether it be rushed releases, bad gameplay ideas, or taking a spin-off game for the PS4, forcing it to be a Wii U exclusive, then banking on it being a smash hit despite poor console sales, subsequently losing $108 million in the aftermath. You know, common problems like that? The release history of our favorite spiked blue abuse victim has led to the fanbase not really knowing what to expect anymore. And at the end of a pretty busy year, with Sonic Frontiers DLC officially concluding and a new $60 game being released for the holiday, out of literally nowhere, SEGA decided to reveal a brand new 3D Sonic game when we least expected it, called Sonic Dream Team. That is an odd logo design. It showcased these bright, vibrant, and somewhat open-ended levels with multiple playable characters to boot. It looked to be fairly intriguing, and coming off of Frontiers with its cookie-cutter reused levels with, in my opinion, a pretty boring-looking skybox, it seemed like a breath of fresh air. But there was one little problem with the trailer. It was sitting right in the corner here. The game is an Apple Arcade exclusive. Don't know what that is? I don't blame you, but essentially it's a gaming-centric streaming service exclusive to Apple devices, and it's mainly just a platform to host good mobile games and make them playable on both phones and the TV. Google has recently been trying to promote their own version of the service, which I think people really only know from the awful advertising campaign.
Bam! 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 Bam!
It's some half-hearted attempt to make mobile gaming come across as more legitimate in the overall gaming space, but as far as I can tell, no one has ever really cared, at least until this game was announced. For some reason, both fans and SEGA alike are treating this game as if it's the next mainline Sonic release, with Ian Flynn, the main Sonic writer, publicly confirming that this game was considered to be canon. Hell, it even got its own animated intro by Tyson Hess, which even Sonic Superstars didn't have. You know, the $60 mainline release? So as you could imagine, there's some genuine hype behind this game, and the obvious subsequent backlash of it being exclusive to a mobile phone-centric streaming platform, so I admittedly became very curious whether or not this game would live up to the hype. And since the only Apple product I own is a 2009 iPod, I decided to pick up the cheapest possible compatible Apple TV. Since any non-Apple owning Sonic fans that want to play this game will most likely resort to using one of these, and I wanted to make sure the game still ran okay on hardware this old. And also, one of the benefits of Apple Arcade is the ability to connect the controller, so it kind of feels like a console game now. We'll begin by going over the story, or lack thereof, since it's the part of the game that I had the least to say about. Nothing personal against what's here or anything, but I typically don't care about the story in these sorts of games, unless it's exceptionally good. And the story here is very much okay. Eggman is in his lab trying to gain access to the Reverie, which is a device that will make the user's dreams come true, but it's being guarded by a device called the Dreamweaver, which is controlled by a new character to this game, Arium. So he attempts to neutralize its power by, kidnapping Cream? You can't just go around doing that. Do you know how illegal that is? It's
The new low, even for you, Doctor.
Hey, that's my line, and it actually gets worse the more you think about it. Since Cream was actually reintroduced to this game, the last time she was seen was in Sonic Generations? Was Eggman kidnapping a child for 12 years? Thankfully his plan doesn't actually work and he ends up getting trapped in his own dreamscape instead. Sonic and friends then shortly show up and end up getting trapped in Eggman's dreamscape as well.
I've heard of falling asleep, but that was ridiculous.
And despite that kind of interesting setup, the rest of the game's plot really boils down to the gang and Arium standing in one room and talking about how they plan on stopping Eggman. I understand the limitations of this being a mobile game at all, but it does feel like they had zero budget for the story, which the slideshow presentation does not help. But I do think it's a fine enough hook for the sake of tying the gameplay together, and if you were expecting this Apple Arcade Sonic game to have some grandiose story, you were setting yourself up for disappointment. Speaking of which, one of my biggest concerns with the game pre-release was the idea that the game was going to be an auto game. Since Apple Arcade has more than its fair share of ports of games like Temple Run and Minion Rush, and every single piece of footage shown pre-release was just the characters running toward the camera or running in general, which genuinely started to worry me. Is every Sonic fan about to get baited? Is the game just going to end up being a forgotten flop in a sea of mediocrity? Did I waste $40 on an Apple TV for no reason? Don't answer that. Well, let's rip off the bandage and answer the main question people had with this game. How does it play? Well, I could tell you that, probably unsurprisingly, for the most part it plays like your average late era boost game, so the controls and general game feel won't be too out of place with what you'd be used to by this point. But you probably already assumed that already based on what I said, so let's focus on the interesting bit, how levels are structured this time around. In a normal boost game, the goal is just to reach the end while barreling through fairly linear levels with some branching paths that reward paying attention to your surroundings. You know, pretty cut and dry for the most part. Dream Team does something unique. Despite appearing like a typical boost level at first glance, it's actually a collectathon in disguise. Most levels are separated into multiple different sections. The first one being the, boost gameplay, when all of a sudden, it opens up and you need to explore multiple branching paths in order to collect 3 keys to open up a gate that leads you towards the rest of the level. Completing the level nets you with what is called a dream orb, which might seem like a pretty familiar progression system. This gameplay structure feels like a mix between the adventure and boost games without really sacrificing any of the appeal from either. Like with the boost mechanic. Despite the boost still being a main part of your arsenal, it's been severely limited this time around. You can boost for maybe a few seconds before it completely depletes, with the trade-off of it refilling on its own over time, making it so the only way to continuously boost is either collect these floating lightning bolts or defeating enemies. So outside of sections specifically designed for long boosting, you're going to find yourself using it in separate bursts most of the time, which I honestly think suits this kind of gameplay better anyway, so it's kind of a net good. Also, speaking of this game being a collectathon, I should probably talk about the collectibles. The levels are scattered with both the familiar 5 red rings and a new collectible in the form of generic looking blue coins to entice the player to go off the beaten path, even in the more linear parts of the level. The red rings have been sized up considerably, so finding these isn't much of a challenge at all, so they're mainly there just to encourage the player to go down offshoot paths during the boost sections. And collecting all 5 nets you an extra dream orb, so they're absolutely worth the frantic panic you experience as you try to change course last second. The blue coins are hidden much better, often being in sections of the map you wouldn't often visit, and I don't think it's much of a stretch to say that these are a pretty direct clone of the purple coins seen in Mario Odyssey. They even net you with a separate optional reward if you find them further in the level, so yeah, it's not exactly subtle. This brings us to my main thesis for how this game is structured. You may have been thinking it already, but honestly the game design here feels an awful lot like 3D Mario. I know what you might be thinking, well Lost World is a ripoff of Galaxy so this isn't new, but I'm not joking, it's more than just the aesthetics. It's tied into the whole structure of the game. The most obvious similarity are the dream orbs, which function essentially the same as stars, with a certain amount of them being required to progress in the game, and each stage has multiple different objectives for additional dream orbs, much the same as you would find in a sandbox Mario game. Although these levels being as short and simplistic as they are fairly small in scope, and these optional objectives can get pretty repetitive. For example, each world has the original reach the end mission, as I've already explained, but they also have a mission for both clearing the level in a certain time limit, and one for going through a series of rings in a designated path, which really don't feel too different from one another. But the mission type I enjoyed the most personally was the one where you collect the dream orb shards, and it's basically the same gameplay as the key collection, except instead there's double the keys and usually some minor layout changes. It's not award-winning game design or anything, but it's undeniably fun to collect these, and it does vaguely remind me of the emerald shard collecting from the adventure games, but that is definitely a stretch. I also noticed how these levels start with the camera panning to hint towards some of the shard locations, which is very much like Galaxy, so I don't think my comparisons are a coincidence. Honestly, this new style of Sonic design is extremely well thought out and is a personal new favorite for me in terms of boost games, and I would love to see this come back in more games in the future. Although, at the same time, it is really funny that they improved the boost Sonic formula by literally just designing it like a Mario game. SEGA, I know it's your plan to surpass Mario in the future, but you don't have to rip them off. This gameplay shift did come at a cost though. Since this is a mobile game at the end of the day, there are aspects of the game that feel severely cut back in order to compensate for Apple's gaming platform, the most glaring of which being the controls. I know Sonic Forces gets a lot of flack for having a limited moveset in comparison to the games that came before it, but those detractors would shudder if you showed them how limited the controls are in Dream Team. The only movement options you have available to you is the ability to jump, boost, switch rails, and homing attack. And that's it aside from one exclusive ability each character type has. That means you can't drift, you can't stomp, you can't even sidestep. It is easily the most simplistic 3D Sonic control scheme to date, unless you count the Sonic World and Sonic Jam, which come on, that doesn't. Now, as weird as it might sound, I actually don't mind this change that much. As I said before, the levels aren't that long and are fairly simplistic, and the greater focus on exploration rather than the high octane action means that the lack of sliding isn't really undermined that much while playing. Really, the only move I missed during my playthrough specifically is the stomp. Since I'm so used to stomping after a homing attack chain that being forced to slowly watch Sonic fall hurts me a little on the inside. Even then, let's be honest, sometimes it's better to not have a mechanic than to shoehorn it in for no reason. You could get something like the drift in the Sonic Frontier cyberspace levels, which is a genuine abomination of mankind, although the homing attack had a pretty interesting change that I don't think any other boost game has. You can now use the homing attack to attach to a grind rail at any point in the rail. I imagine this was just another change made to accommodate the difference in platform, but it's honestly borderline broken. If you're about to miss a branching path or you see a grind rail across a giant gap, 9 times out of 10 you can just jump, boost, and homing attack and make it. My speedrunning wired brain loves this mechanic, and I think it unintentionally fits into the open level design with all the new ways to get around. Although keep in mind it does come with a fair amount of jank, but I think that kind of just comes with the territory here. On that note, I think we should talk about the presentation. It's honestly extremely impressive considering the platform. Setting this game inside Eggman's dreamscape gave the developers a ton of creative freedom that they take full advantage of. Each of the 4 worlds in this game are very visually distinct in both theming and color scheme. From the water-filled scrambled shores to the blocky nightmare maze, each world has its own theme that it sticks to that helps keep the experience fresh despite the repetitive mission objectives. I'm also equally impressed by how detailed the backgrounds are to these levels. How come scrambled shores can have visuals like this when Sonic Frontiers just use Sonic Generations backwash for its levels? Man, screw the cyberspace levels. But that's only half the story, since I have a slight confession. The gameplay you've seen in this video so far wasn't from the Apple TV I mentioned, and there is a reason for that. Because playing this game on 2015 hardware was interesting to say the least. It started off normal enough. Now sure, it looks incredibly crusty and chugged a fair bit, but for games running off of this thing, that's actually pretty common. That being said, I've dealt with much worse, so I started playing through the first world. But as it went on, it felt like it was getting laggier, and eventually it became borderline unplayable. So I thought this port was just completely busted. Well, I found out that if you reset the game, which means resetting the Apple TV entirely because Apple's a good company, that the game's frame rate returned to normal, meaning that this game or this device suffers from memory leaking. So the longer the play session, the worse the game runs until this happens. Now, as obviously unacceptable as this is, I think it might only affect the Generation 4 Apple TV, which was the one that I was playing on. During my playthrough, despite the claims on the store of it being compatible on my device, I had the game crash twice, freeze during a loading screen once, and it soft locked during a boss. And when I recorded the supplemental gameplay, I had none of these issues at all. So it's possible that Sega Hardlight probably spent little or no time testing the game's performance on a specific model, and since it only happens on this, it probably went unnoticed. In my opinion, I think they should either patch this immediately or mark it as incompatible in the store, since no one should have to jump through hoops just to play this game in an acceptable state. Normally when I go on a tangent like this in a video, I'm lying. I would, but like I said before, there are probably people who picked up this exact Apple TV purely for this game, like me. So I thought I would provide this warning. Moving on, let's talk about one of the big selling points, the 6 playable characters. It's the first time most of these characters have been playable in a mainline Sonic game in 17 years, or 3 months. Kind of funny. This game separates the characters into 3 different playstyles: the speed type, the flying type, and the Knuckles type. It goes without saying that most people's excitement for these was stemmed by people's desperation for an ever open-ended game-like adventure, but I'd be lying if I said it wasn't affected nostalgia. This game starts you out with just Sonic and Amy. You then unlock the rest of the characters in pairs as you complete each world, with each world focusing on a certain playstyle. It's a pretty obvious way to encourage the player to try out each of the character types without directly forcing you to, except for the missions where they directly force you to, so oops, I guess not. I mentioned it earlier, but every class has its own special ability, with the speed class being able to light speed dash, which is just you homing attacking into the rings. The flying characters can use these mid-air rings to take shortcuts in the levels, although your flying ability is very limited otherwise. Lastly, Knuckles can climb walls and glide. You might have noticed that I haven't been mentioning one of the characters by name. Well, unfortunately, the voice actress for Rouge is apparently pretty problematic for a variety of reasons, the most notable of which being how bad she is at voice acting Rouge.
You're shaping up to be quite the impressive young man.
Seriously, what happened? In all seriousness, the multiple selectable characters is a nice way to add some depth to the levels, and I really appreciate having the characters play so similarly to one another, so people can really choose whichever character they want without feeling like they're sacrificing playability. Although the game does have 3 separate missions per world that just consist of beating the level with each separate character type, which comes across as undeniably cheap padding. This also extends to the earlier levels hiding some collectibles behind optional paths, which does make 100%ing this game really annoying if you didn't know that. Although you can switch between them at any time in the levels that allow it, so it's at least pretty tolerable. Either way, having the other characters is a net good to the game, even ignoring the gameplay differences. Just being able to play as someone who isn't Sonic for once is such a breath of fresh air, and the game even has 2 separate cutscenes for the bosses depending on what character you choose, which is something that I really appreciated. It just shows how much care went into the presentation of this game. And since I should probably mention this somewhere in the video, I might as well cover the individual worlds in some detail. Despite each world only containing 4 unique missions, or I guess I should call them acts since this is a Sonic game, each world actually evolves visually the further you progress through them, which I really appreciated since the only other 3D Sonic game I can think of that does this is Sonic Heroes. And with me being a fan of that game, I very quickly picked up on this the more I played. With Scrambled Shores, it's fairly subtle since it goes from each level being open-ended and surrounded by water streams to being vertically oriented and surrounded by clouds instead. I don't think this world is mind-blowing or anything, but it is the first world, so it serves its purpose of introducing the player to the basic mechanics. The boss of this world is Dr. Crabulous, who, as you guessed it, is a
Giant enemy crab.
and is actually an inflatable to match the beach theme of the world. The boss fight seems fairly standard, just wait for an opening then homing attack, except each time you attack the boss, it deflates a little. So once you reach the final health bar, there is nothing the boss can do to attack you, so it just runs around as a tiny little puny crab that can't hurt you until you finish it off. A really fun way to end off this first world. Dream Factory, like the name implies, is the factory level of this game. It starts off with these very vertical levels that are obviously designed to utilize the flying characters, but as the levels progress, they become flatter over time, coinciding with more purple being added to the color scheme, which is explained as Eggman corrupting the imagination, which sounds like a plot point ripped out of a Knight's game, but whatever. This world definitely felt a lot larger than the first, with most rooms requiring the player to scale up multiple levels in order to continue through the stage, although I feel like it was a little hard to navigate as a result, since it is pretty easy to get a little confused trying to figure out which direction is the right way. But this is probably the most Sonic Adventure feeling world of the 4, although I think that's just due to it being built around the slower pace of the flying mechanics. And sadly, the boss isn't really that interesting this time around. It consists of multiple egg bots that'll try to connect using laser beams or attack you as they move around the level, but honestly it's really easy to dodge these laser attacks, so the slower pace of each cycle really just starts to drag a little bit, which is compounded by this boss also having the most amount of hit points. Plus, it's really easy to just cheese by hugging the flying tokens repeatedly in order to stay in the air the whole fight. Overall, not really that impressed. The world itself is pretty cool though. Nightmare Maze was my personal favorite out of the 4, since it completely drops the act and just fully embraces the Mario Galaxy influence. This world is entirely centered around running up walls and changing the center of gravity. Honestly, this world is just straight up fantastic, and it shows that these more open-ended exploratory levels like this should be in Sonic games. There are water geysers that can send you to branching paths, the shard collecting mission was very interesting, it even has a cylindrical section which I'm convinced was trying to reference Lost World, and it doesn't make me want to vomit. This is the only world that you could take out of Dream Team, and I think that it would truly stand on its own. The end boss is also pretty interesting as well. It's structured like a typical auto runner boost Sonic boss, where you need to dodge obstacles, until you see an Eggman robot, where upon hitting it, it will stun the boss and allow you to get a hit in. Once you do, the boss will Thanos snap, and the gravity will shift, so you need to climb up the wall onto a different part of the arena to continue attacking the boss. It's nothing too crazy in terms of a switch up, but I thought it was really cool to see a boss like this do something unique, since we've seen the same reused auto running boss design several times with little change. Lastly, Ego City is kind of what you'd expect for a final Sonic world. It reuses all the level gimmicks from the previous world, most notably these glass pipes which are literally just the geysers from the previous world again, and the levels are much more wide open and full of hazards and paths to go down, with Eggman in the back demeaning you the whole time.
Speed limit is a strict 5 miles per hour. Absolutely no going fast allowed.
The whole 9 yards. I do think that aesthetically this level looks the least compromised. Like sure, all of the audience in the background are obviously 2D, but this still wouldn't look too out of place in a console Sonic game. The stages themselves are quite good as well, but they didn't really have that same wow factor that the previous world had. The gimmick here is just the introduction of disappearing floors, which are honestly not even really a threat at all, so I tend to forget that they're even there most of the time. But even then, the levels here are debatably the best put together in the whole game, and the final act visually is a treat to the eyes. Seriously, throw the cyberspace levels in the trash. They wish they had this much spectacle. And now that that's done, let's talk about the final boss of the game. So, spoiler alert, I guess. It's Eggman again, or more accurately, it's Nightmare Eggman, which I found to be a little surprising and a bit lame. I thought that it would end up being the new character RM based on what we saw from the animated intro, and also this particular set of lines from one of the first cutscenes in the game.
You, Sonic, need no introduction. Now, I need your legendary heroism and skill to recover the Dream Orbs. I'm sorry, I'm not strong enough to free everyone yet.
Yeah, I know it's kind of a stretch, but I don't know, I had this weird vibe that she would end up backstabbing us eventually. I know it wouldn't really make that much sense given how we are in Eggman's dreams, but I still think it may have been possible. Now, calling this a boss is a little disingenuous, since it's pretty much just a regular stage with Eggman appearing as a stage obstacle. It's comparable to the stage portions of the Dark Gaia fight in Unleashed, especially aesthetically. The goal was to carry an orb that houses Ariam, don't ask, to the Dream Core in order to save the day. Throughout the stage, the orb gets passed along, so you have the opportunity to use all 6 characters throughout. And as neat as an endgame gimmick as it is, each section is fairly short, so the layout of the stage is a little weak when compared to the previous 2 worlds. But I get it, it's about the spectacle mainly, so that's more of a nitpick anyway. We need to stop Eggman from— what is that? Why does the animation for Eggman look so bad? It's practically no animation at all. You can see the budget for the game running out in real time. I like seeing Eggman attacking the stage as you play, but man, any tension that might have existed just evaporates the second I see the giant floating Eggman heads in the background. It's extremely uncanny. But once you climb up a few disembodied arms and finish your emotional recovery from the animation, you finally bring the orb to the Dream Sphere and return to the real world. Eggman's plans are ruined, Cream is rescued, and Tails takes the reverie away so SEGA can pretend that this game is canon. So is Sonic Dream Team worth playing? That's kind of a hard question to answer. To the surprise of me and probably many others, the overall game design and levels were honestly very enjoyable throughout, and genuinely impressed me at times. For what boils down to essentially just a gateway into an Apple streaming service, it had plenty of love and care put into it, and it shows throughout the game. The greater focus on exploration and collectibles was a breath of fresh air, even if it was just to make the game easier to develop for phone hardware. Now granted, this does come with a fair amount of obvious setbacks considering what platform it's on, with the slideshow cutscenes and blatantly simplistic controls, but that didn't really bother me personally. If anything, I blame any of the issues I had during my playthrough to the unusable garbage I had to buy in order to experience this. Which brings us to the biggest question when it comes to this game. Should you get an Apple Arcade subscription in order to play this game? If you already have an Apple device new enough to play it without issue, then I think it's worth the $7 it would cost to try it out. But if you don't, then I wouldn't bother. Playing this isn't going to be some life-changing experience worthwhile enough to sink that much money into it. But on the bright side, there has been some discussion about the possibility of this game getting ported to other consoles once the exclusivity deal runs out, since there is definitely enough outcry for SEGA to consider doing so. Also, since I went through the trouble of accessing Apple Arcade for one game, I might as well do a review of the service as a whole. Since this game was supposed to be a means to get gamers into this ecosystem, so is it really worth subscribing to? The short answer is no. Most of the games available on Apple Arcade are simply just mobile games that already exist, just with the microtransactions taken out, which becomes pretty apparent if you look at the menus of any of these for more than like 5 seconds. Does that mean that every game on here is bad necessarily? No, but being able to connect an Xbox controller doesn't change the fact that I'm still paying $7 a month to play Temple Run 1. Now in their defense, there are real games on this service like Dead Cells and nothing else. Dead Cells is a great game, don't get me wrong, but it's a game that you can buy on any other platform, and I think they knew this was an issue as well, since the service has multiple games that are direct shameless clones of Nintendo properties, like Warped Kart Racers, which is pretty much just Mario Kart 8 with Hank Hill and Peter Griffin as playable characters, and it's honestly pretty solid as a game, so I don't have anything to complain about. But then there is Hello Kitty Island Adventure. Doesn't this look familiar? The intro sequence in the plane where you get to customize your character, the blocky indoor environments, unlocking apps to use on a phone. This is a completely original idea for a game. Honestly, the only real exclusives that the service has are the SEGA games on offer, which isn't really that surprising given SEGA's relationship with Apple in the past.
I'm a hardcore gamer.
But much like the Neo Geo Pocket Color, having one good Sonic game is not enough to convince people to care. I would not be surprised if most people who went out of their way to play this game just signed up for the free trial and canceled when they finished, because that's certainly what I did. Although that being said, I played this, and I'm sure at least a handful of other Sonic fans did. So even if I won't be keeping my Apple Arcade subscription, there is always a small chance that someone did. So really it was a win-win for both SEGA and Apple. Maybe it is a chance that more real games come to this service now and it becomes good all of a sudden. But as it stands, Sonic Dream Team is a very weird game that certainly deserves praise for what it is, but will likely become forgotten once the Sonic cycle finds its next victim. I do certainly hope that the mainline games take some design cues from it moving forward, since I think this kind of gameplay could really benefit a theoretical Sonic Frontiers 2. Plus, come on, are you really gonna let the throwaway mobile game be the one we remember fondly? But all we can do as fans is simply speculate to ourselves for the foreseeable future. And hey, maybe it will get ported to the Switch eventually. It would be fairly odd to have a straight up mobile game on consoles for a series this large, but hey, I'm sure it'll happen. Remember what happened to Choo Choo Rocket Universe when its deal ran out? I have some bad news.
This is just not worth my time from top to bottom, just a complete waste.